Throughout this year, we have been exploring tools for being human. What are those things that we wish we had come programmed with instructions to do from the jump, but are actually a struggle to learn? And today we're talking about letting go, moving on, which I think is one of those tools that we struggle with both for ourselves, but also in relationship to other people. Letting go and moving on is a breeding ground for platitudes. Things like, maybe you can fill in the blank. Time heals all wounds. When one door closes, another one opens. Everything happens for a reason. These simple platitudes don't actually help anyone move on. They mostly exist, like lots of things we say when someone has something they want to move on from. They mostly exist to make the sayer feel better about themselves, to help them minimize all of the icky feelings we get when someone holds out their hand with a difficult emotion in it and says, "This is what I'm feeling," and we say, "Ooh, that sounds hard." Good vibes only. And that particularly, we struggle to hold out our hand and tell open-hearted stories about failure. And I use failure here pretty broadly. This past fall, we did a whole service about grief, right? About how to grieve ourselves and how to support people who are grieving when someone close to us has died. But there is also this whole other host of things in life from which one might need to move on. How many of us have had a relationship end? A friendship or a romantic one? We've had bad breakups. We've changed careers. We've lost a job. We've had a family relationship blow up in our faces. And that in each of those spaces, it's so easy to just feel like a failure. Because it's true, something has gone wrong. The thing that you thought was going to keep happening has stopped happening. Right? The thing that you thought would last has not lasted, and it feels like failing. And there is so much shame wrapped up in that, and that's why I so deeply appreciated Amanda's story. Because we struggle to talk about our failure in a way that's an open hand. Sometimes we talk about our failures as a closed fist, right? Because our failure is entirely someone else's fault. And we just talk about how outraged we are about this terrible thing that has happened. Or sometimes we hide, right? The shame is so deep we can't talk about it at all. But this morning, I want to invite us to think about how can we hold those failures that are an inevitable part of human life, hold them in an open palm to one another. My failure story for sharing this morning starts about 3 years ago, when Unitarian Universalist ministers search for a new job. We do it in a very peculiar way because, of course, we can't do anything normally. We gotta be special about everything. And one of the special things that we do is that when you are in search, right, looking for a job, you sort of start with a big open pool of possible congregations and a big open pool of possible ministers, and then you sort of narrow it down and down and down until at the very end, you get ready to do what's called candidating, meaning that you go and have a final interview with a whole congregation before they vote on you. It's like 9 days of what ministers jokingly call to each other trial by potluck. Which is, I should say, the first time I candidated at the church that I served in Cheyenne, I would have to, I would be at like an event with tons of food and they would get to the end of it and I would realize I had eaten like one slice of cheese and a cracker because it was just constant talking. I would have to like drive through and get a burrito every night because I hadn't eaten since like breakfast. But so in the search, right, when you get to that point of candidating that trial by potluck with a congregation, you have ruled out all other options than each other. Right, the minister has had to say no to all the other places they might go, and the congregation has had to say no to all the other ministers. So it's pretty high stakes when you get to that point. And about 3 years ago, I ended up as the candidate for a senior minister position at the Unitarian Church in St. Paul, Minnesota. It was a big, old, historic congregation, right? The vibe, to give you a sense of the vibe, they like etch the minister's name in stone on the wall. Thank you for just hanging up a picture like regular people. It feels a lot more human, so thank you. Even that, I'm like, oh God, my picture's on the wall. And this was a congregation who had had a long tenured beloved ministry that ended during the pandemic. They hadn't really done very good interim work. And they also, in the 80s and 90s, had a history of ministers who had had bad boundaries with the people in the congregation. And all of those things meant that there was all sorts of unresolved conflict underneath the surface. And so I got there for 9 days of trial by potluck. And all of that unresolved conflict, as it sometimes does when change is about to happen. It's like, right, you ever notice how your family at like a wedding or a funeral, everyone gets really messy in your family, all the weird unresolved conflict comes to the surface? Same concept. All the unresolved conflict starts to surface. And as you probably could guess, since I am here today and not in St. Paul, Minnesota, the vote to call me as their minister was not successful. It was sort of like it went spectacularly bad. I'm really a nothing by half measures person, and this really emphasized that for me. Go big or go home. And the funny part about my failure story is that when you are a minister, you think to yourself sometimes, you might be thinking, well, surely you had this enormous professional community of people who would all understand. They must have known exactly what to say when you were at your next professional conference, right? No. People did not know what to say. They would say, my favorite was, I've been thinking a lot about you. No other context. Like, oh, good. That seems great. Or there were the looky-loos who I could tell were just fishing for gossip, including one colleague. I love them, but they began to fish for gossip without realizing that I was the person who had been the candidate at the congregation. I hate to throw my colleagues under the bus, but right, we're human beings just like you all. And we are particularly human to each other. And so, if this group of Unitarian Universalist clergy can't figure out how to say something helpful to someone who has had an enormous, very public failure, how can the rest of us be expected to? But we can. And I think that for me, one of the helpful tools is to think about the urge that's underneath the platitudes that we so frequently offer one another. Like, what's underneath that? And how can we ask a different question instead? Right, and you'll notice that it's right that instead of a platitude, it's a question. And not what really happened. So, my one platitude, time heals all wounds. But as Amanda talked about, that so many of us try to put the failures of our lives into a fireproof box inside of us where we don't have to talk about them, we don't have to feel the feelings. And so time can only do what we let it. And that sometimes time can give us the value of perspective, right? We can see things that we can't see when we're so close to something, but it can't do anything that we won't let it. So maybe we could ask something like, instead of saying, time heals all wounds, we could say something like, how can I help you hold this? Right? Which is, but you have to mean it. You have to mean that you're willing for someone to say, it would be helpful if you listened to me. And then you would have to do the listening. Right? When one door closes, another one opens. And this one was hard for me to get beyond the platitude because the truth was that, right, another door did open for me. It was here. And so it was really easy in collegial spaces with all my minister friends to just be like, it's fine. That didn't hurt at all because I found the best congregation. The people are so great. I'm having a great time. I'm fine. I'm fine. I'm fine. They're so great. And the truth was you were really great. So it was easy to feel like I had sort of triumphed in some way because I found such wonderful people and such a great place. And I will say that first winter I was here, it was really mild here in the Fox Cities, and they had record snowfall in the Twin Cities. But of course, as anyone who has had failure knows, the truth is that when one door closes, sometimes you just want to sit leaning up against the door for an indeterminate amount of time. You don't really want to go through another door. You're like, this door was the one I had picked. And for me, it was. I had felt like this was what I wanted to do. This was my professional dream. This was everything I had been working towards. And so the idea that just like, well, sorry. It's like, no, I gotta like hang out in this feeling for a minute before I'm ready to move on. Right? When one door closes, another one might open, but that doesn't mean you have to go through it. So maybe a question you could ask instead of saying, when one door closes, another one opens, is what feels like the very next step for you? Which could be as short term as like tomorrow. And it turns out, right, the very next step is like, go get a cup of coffee and be. And the biggest, most all encompassing platitude of all, everything happens for a reason. And that one's hard because it, as Unitarian Universalists, we have a lot of different ways that we all make sense out of suffering, right? Both our own suffering and the suffering of those we love. And everything happens for a reason. Sometimes helps us get through the suffering, but sometimes it makes our suffering feel like somebody, some cosmic person, some cosmic being somewhere said, you know what? I really feel like Hannah needs more suffering. Just seems like there's not enough suffering. What if we did more suffering for Hannah? And that version of that theology, we broadly reject that as Unitarian Universalists. We do not think that there is some cosmic being who's punishing us or trying to teach us a lesson. But we also have to make sense out of the bad things that happen. And if we just pass it off as like, well, sometimes it sucks, that doesn't really help us make sense of suffering either. So instead of everything happens for a reason, I think about the truth that everything might not happen for a reason, but we can consider why we are making each choice we're making. Right? We can move deliberately, whether it's through our own failure or in relationship to someone else's. So the next time someone shares something, some uncomfortable failure with you, and you feel yourself go, maybe consider the question, what is important to you right now? What's important to you right now? Because when we ask someone, when we say something like everything happens for a reason, what we're trying to do is make the pain feel less. But minimizing pain doesn't make it any less painful. Minimizing shame or grief doesn't make it any less difficult. But what can help us move on, what can help us make that next step is by identifying what matters to us, right? What is actually guiding us in this moment? Beyond the grief, beyond the shame, beyond the anger, what's really guiding you? Because one of the most helpful things for me was when I actually asked for what I needed from my colleagues. Because the truth is, when we gather in big groups, we're very human. But there's one Facebook group of Unitarian Universalist colleagues that I love dearly. It's a gathering of Gen X and millennial ministers. There's a lot of snark. You are not shocked to learn. But there's also an ability to be a little more vulnerable with one another. And so what I asked for, what was important to me, was that I needed help making a playlist. I was like, I need your best songs that speak to this moment for me, that speak to the grief and the anger that I feel. And when I tell you we assembled a beautiful playlist, we assembled a beautiful playlist. Like Beastie Boys, Rage Against the Machine, Four Non-Blondes, so good. Little Ariana Grande sprinkled on the side from the younger millennials. Telling stories about our failure matters, not because we want to dwell in our failure, but because our ability to do hard things together matters. It has always mattered. And when we look at our world now, our ability to be real with one another, to talk about our difficult emotions with one another, to be present to that, it matters more than ever. And a community where we can do that matters too. May we be that community for one another. May it be so. Amen.